Season 1, Episode 9 of the Potomac RPG Podcast. Wait, you mean to tell me I have to read this entire book?
Welcome one and all to the Potomac RPG Podcast, your source for old news, tired conversation, and mediocre advice for all of your favorite tabletop role-playing games. I'm your host and ridiculously complex flavor text, Adam.
I'm your trap-filled TPK dungeon, Matt.
And I'm your ignored plot hook, Tom.
Thank you so much for being on, guys. We're just recovering from a hell of a dungeon crawl last night in our Descent into Avernus campaign that Steve is running. I think at one point, 2 or 3 of our players were down. No spell slots left, no nothing. We are really hobbled and just limping along right now. Tom, your character Andreas actually is down currently in between session here. Pretty tough dungeon crawl so far, huh?
Yeah, and one thing that I think you missed when we were talking about after you left the call is Andreas. I took so much damage that I would have been killed outright if it hadn't been for the temporary hit points that Tormund had given him twice.
The Artificer comes through. I finally got a chance to use the Eldritch Cannon Protector, and I keep Andreas around.
Because I only had, I think, 2 hit points, and then twice I went down, and I was like running the calculations. I'm like, wait, did I go over my max health in negatives? Yeah. And I was off by a couple hit points because of those temporary hit points. Otherwise, I would have just been killed outright.
Now, Matt, your character is not doing too shabby right now.
Yeah, well, my character is a spineless coward, so that's why. I definitely built Decorius as a really defensive character. I mean, so he either shoots from range or he gets in and as a rogue has the bonus action to disengage. And so, especially with Booming Blade, if I hit, it's like, well, the enemy can chase me, but then they're going to eat the sonic damage. So I'm not a very appealing target to single melee attacks, but I did eat a lot of damage from the Necro Ball because I really have no special defenses against area effect spells.
That's true. Yeah. And I mean, it kind of brings us to this topic because obviously Descent into Avernus is a official campaign module. And that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be looking at all those books that are collecting dust on our shelves, years and years and editions worth of adventure modules. And Matt, I mean, you have one of the longest histories of anyone in the group, with these official adventure modules. Like what sets them apart from a homebrew adventure in terms of what the pros and cons are?
Well, I think when you buy an official module, you're really expecting it to be play tested a lot. So when you do a homebrew module, the DM, maybe he knows his party and he'll put together what he thinks is an appropriate challenge and how he thinks things are going to go. And sometimes, he or she is like totally wrong and things, will go totally off the rails. Now, an official module, things can go off the rails too, but presumably in an official module, they've spent a lot of time play testing the module, so they kind of know how things can go, how often things will succeed or fail, where choke points are. So when you finally get the finished product, it should run a little more smoothly. I think that's more true now than it was back in the days of second edition or first edition. But I think that's what players have come to expect.
Well, what about the cons? Like, is there any, what are the disadvantages to an official module?
Well, I think an official module, obviously they have to stick with the in-world canonical lore. So if you have a campaign setting where wizards or Paizo or whoever has great creative control over the setting, obviously they're not going to take it in directions that, totally bork the setting, unless it's the culmination of some, huge adventure where things could like destroy the world. But, in a homebrew, there's freedom to, play around with a lot more things in setting, I think, which for some types of groups could be more appropriate.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, Tom, you're just getting into DMing now. What's your view on the adventure module rather than homebrewing something?
Because I've tried actually doing my own, like, 'cause I was trying to help Anthony a few times with these, like, oh, could you make this like separate module for things? And I've tried, making it from scratch. And the biggest thing for me is just filling the world. Like taking, for homebrew is, you're like, oh, how many NPCs do you need? What's a good number? Okay, now I have to fill out all their backstories and give us some depth and all this stuff. And the one thing that I really like about modules is, as a fledgling DM, is that a lot of that world like bones are there. Mm-hmm. There's names, there's kind of the monotony of it is, there's names, there's faces, there's places, and all that's done. And then you can flare it up as you see fit, giving voices or not, or changing how their personalities are, how they can interact with the characters. So you have that jumping off point that really takes a lot of the excess, just filler work out of it, I feel.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, adventure modules are cool and all. I read through a few, and I haven't DM'd an official D&D module before, but just reading through, I like, especially as a crutch, as a new DM, being able to lean on stuff like that. But in other respects, it can be a little restrictive, especially if you have players like our group who like to send things way off the rails. And now suddenly that crutch isn't supporting you anymore, as I'm sure many first-time DMs have run into. But yeah, let's get a little deeper into this. Let's get into some questions. The first post we have comes from Reddit user Wilhelm Idrisil, who asks, new DM, what edition and module should I use? New DM with a new group looking to start our first D&D tabletop. Wondering what might be the best place to start for edition and module versus homebrew. Thanks. So, Tom, let's start with you here. What adventure do you think a new DM with a new group should start with?
So, having just done this with people, again, who have not played D&D before, I've been a player for a few years. I've only played 5th edition. And I do enjoy it. So I would suggest 5th edition because it's the most accessible, at least to my understanding. And it's new. It's relatively new. So there's more, the resources are more readily available. I actually, because they're relatively cheap and they're pretty inclusive, is the Lost Mines of Phandelver and also the Dragon of Icepire Peak. They both take place in the exact same setting, and are even, most of it's in the exact same town, so they have so much overlap. You can actually combine the two if you wish to kind of fill it out a bit more. Sure. Lost Mines of Phandelver is more of a linear, like, okay, you're doing this task, then that directly leads to the next story beat, which directly leads to the next story beat, and so on. Whereas Dragon of Icepire Peak is more of a, okay, you're in the town. What are you going to do? Here's some rumors that are going on, or here's some jobs on the job board that are going on. But it's very open world, very sandboxy, and there's not really a good plot hook or direction. So I feel combining them kind of, they help each other. As one gives the other more direction, and then one gives the other more body or fluff to kind of fill it out a bit. And it's very, very smooth in terms of like the here's a dungeon, here's how it works, step by step. Things are numbered. There's this many monsters of this type of monster in this room. Here's how they behave. It's very, very, it walks you through really, really well. That being said, as we just mentioned about how, there's some rigidity and how players always throw it off. When I was prepping even like the first dungeon, I'm like, okay, how does this work? And there's 1,000,001 YouTube videos out there explaining like, this is the steps and walk you through the dungeon or whatever that quest is. And they're like, okay, they're going to get to this room and the players can do this and this and this. They give you like 3 choices, and even the module,
we're going with number 4.
Huh? Yes.
Well, I've fall into an empty white space.
I've had 2. I've run the same sequence with 2 different groups, and neither group followed what either the module or any of the like YouTube videos or anything suggested. It's like, okay, you come in here and this goblin will do X, and you have a choice of doing A or B. And I've had people say, charge in. It's like, no, we're attacking. We're not even paying attention to X. And I've had people say, actually, no, we're going to persuade or do this. So it's just like, okay, I'm trying to figure it out. But that's part of being a DM, is if you think you can DM and not have to think on your feet, then you're going to be in for a rude awakening. I know that's kind of hard, but
Sure.
You're going to have to be able to react to players and their changes, how they change the story, because, they're living people who will react completely different from a book will tell you that they will react.
Well, Matt, how about you? In terms of
What
a
module?
new DM with a new group, what would you start with?
So first, I'll give a non-recommendation. For a new group, I do not recommend playing first or second edition with classic adventures like the Tomb of Horrors or Lost Caverns of Sojap. They're great adventures, in the day, but if you will have to make 5 or 6 alternate characters to get through those. I mean, you will die. Characters will die left and right. I recommend either 3rd 3.5 Pathfinder or 5e to start. It really just depends on what kind of scaling for bonuses you like. I think that's the difference between the systems. For 3rd edition, I recommend Return to Temple of Elemental Evil. It's a redo of the original Temple of Elemental Evil, but it's meant for 3rd edition. I think it's by Monty Cook. It's a pretty good starter adventure, I think. If you play Pathfinder, either a Pathfinder system or the OGL, Rise of the Rune Lords and Legacy of Fire were kind of their starting, what they call adventure paths, which are basically campaigns. So you play them as a series of 5 or 6 modules in a row. But those are pretty straightforward, and they're not too difficult. And I think they're kind of fun adventures. For 5e, I haven't played it, but I have some experience with the setting. I have heard a lot of recommendations for Curse of Strahd, which is a revamp of the original Ravenloft adventure. You go through Ravenloft Castle and confront Strahd von Zarvik, who's this, really awesome vampire lord. And I've heard nothing but great things about it, and it's really geared, I think, for the lower tiers, levels. It scales, I think, maybe like 1 to, I don't know, like 8, 9, or 10 or something. But that I've heard really good things about that adventure, and it might be a good 5e, especially standalone if you don't want to enmesh in another campaign setting.
Excellent. Well, I mean, I think all of those are great recommendations, and hopefully, Wilhelm, that helps you decide on what edition and module that you should use.
I have news here.
And the sound of Ralphie the News Goblin can mean only one thing. It's time for Potomac RPG News. All right, got a couple news items to cover here. First up, the big news that came out this week is the upcoming release of a new adventure, Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden. Pretty awesome setting here, and I'm curious what you guys think about this. Matt, what do you think of the upcoming release?
Well, I'm kind of hoping for two things. I mean, the first is, given that it takes place in Icewind Dale in what looks like a fairly rural area, really, I think survival, environmental survival should be a key aspect. And D&D's never really had a good handle on that. Oh, you're in the desert, make a Constitution check, or oh, you're on a glacier, make a Constitution check. but it would be nice to have kind of more fleshed out rules for things like camping and food, and because you're going to be in frozen terrain with far from civilization. The second thing is they've built it as being a horror based campaign, and I kind of have mixed feelings about that, because I kind of think the horror aspect's probably going to fail. Horror is hard to do in general in any genre, whether it's movies or role-playing games. And I think it's especially difficult in RPGs because your characters are used to being kind of these, heroic ass kickers. And it's kind of difficult to it's not just a question of making them afraid, but of making the players afraid or disturbed or just have a sense of dread hanging over where you kind of reveal small things where where it's not the monster, but what you think might be the monster, I guess. And that's
Exactly.
it's very hard to do that. And I don't know if that can succeed or not. I mean, they've billed it as horror. We'll see. I mean, there's also horror, body horror. I mean, Anthony loves to do that, where, it's like the thing, like, you get possessed by a goo that turns you into some kind of horrible monster, But I think when they say horror, I think they really mean, kind of that, idea of dread and isolation and all of that. And I don't know. It's a hard thing to do in an RPG, and I hope it succeeds. That's what they're billing as, as the theme of it. But we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with you there. When I read about the horror aspect, I was like that you're walking on thin ice there, no pun intended. But like it's like I know. I'm sorry. So the survival aspect is awesome. Yeah, I agree completely. It fails so many other times. Hopefully they can really get that down pat. It's something that oftentimes is just discarded. I can't remember the last time we cared about food or water rations.
And it can play very strongly into a horror theme, where
sure.
where, resources are running low, and the conflict is much against the environment, as against the monsters, or both in the case of the movie The Descent. But that was a great horror movie. But that's an example of survival and horror, and maybe they'll be able to hit on a similar synergy, but we'll see.
Yeah, here's hoping. Well, Tom, are you excited for this news about Icewind Dale?
I am. And real quick, first thing I want to point out, Matt, your assessment was very interesting to hear you mention all those things, because I just this morning saw an interview with Chris Perkins where he mentioned not only that the goal for the horror aspect is isolation and how, the concept of being alone, but he implied that a lot of his inspiration was from John Carpenter's The Thing. Like that concept of being a group of people in, a frozen wasteland, you're isolated from no help, no one coming, and that you don't. The biggest aspect of the horror is not knowing where the monster is, who the monster is, and it could be any one of you. And that aspect of not knowing. And one of the things they even played into was you mentioned that the book, it's like 300 some pages, and the biggest part of the module is the fact that they have a whole new bestiary, and a lot of it are variations of creatures that exist. But the big point of it is because a lot of people now, it's like, oh, they know the monster manual. It's like, oh, we're going to face this. We know what the weakness is. All the players kind of are experienced with it. And one of the aspects is to have this turning some of the creature concepts on their heads, so that when players come in, they're like, wait, that creature can't do that, can it? And then they're nervous because they don't know what they're coming across. As a mechanical twist on the horror aspect. But yeah, it's funny when you're mentioning this. I'm like, you're basically just paraphrasing what Chris Perkins said as like the author, which is kind of cool that you kind of like, yeah, you're right. You're that.
Yeah, I hadn't read anything about it, but I'm not surprised that that The Thing would be an inspiration, because that is a classic of horror. Well, the John Carpenter remake, is the second one, but yeah.
Well, and another interesting part of the article that I read about this that also digs into our next news item was the announcement of more inclusion within the D&D scape, if you will, in terms of how humanoids such as orcs and goblins, how they've long been portrayed as evil monsters and not people. And now there seems to be this push to address alignment issues and the treatment of these historically like labeled as evil monsters. So what do you think about mixing up this kind of inclusion to make it more meaningful, I would say? Yeah, Tom, what do you think on what D&D announced?
So I'm a little bit mixed feelings in some of the things, depending how they actually handle it. They can talk about, they want to make some changes, but until I see the changes, one of the things that kind of was a raised eyebrow on was the races or species, because they technically are different species, base stats. Because it would make sense that if you have a giant lizard creature as your player character, then they're going to probably be stronger than your average human or a gnome. I would and they said that they're going to try to remove stats that are tied to that species. I would hope that they would give you a blanket stat base, like, okay, you can add a +2 and a +1 to whatever you want to whatever race or species again. So that I can do my Dragonborn, and maybe he's a weaker Dragonborn, so I don't add that +2 to strength. I add it somewhere else to make the character more unique. But I hope they don't like try to nerf it so much that basically all the characters are the same, and it's just like, okay, what, you're just picking a different flavor for the same thing. Like, okay, it's a human, it's a Dragonborn, it's a cat creature, it's an elf, it's a dwarf. Like, they're all basically appear the same because you're removing what makes those species unique.
Yeah, it's going to be a line for them to walk, and I understand what they're doing here, and I appreciate that they announced this 6-point plan to kind of advance the idea of inclusion, not only within the writing itself, but also in the community and how they promote things, which is great, and especially when they're looking at races like orcs and drow, like that I think it's time to revisit that and make it make sense, make it certainly less controversial. I mean, it there's so much kind of history eaten up in this, and that's just something that I think needs to be taken care of. Now, how far down that line do you go? Like, would a tabaxi be, have, like you said, Tom, the same stats as whatever other species that was out there? I don't know. I don't know where that line is. I can say that I appreciate them moving in this direction. Matt, what do you think about this advance of inclusion?
Well, first I should say I'm a little less woke, I think, than most gamers. So of their points, one point they made, which I fully agree with, is there's really an issue with using real world groups as templates. I mean, the Vistani and Ravenloft are the best example of that. It's based on the Roma, and that's something that should be right out. I mean, you really, it's not appropriate. I have no problem with evil races per se. I think part of it is people are projecting real world anxieties onto a fantasy game, and maybe some of that is one of the concepts that's arisen in the political left over the years, is this idea of sort of blank slate, that anyone can be anything in any way. And so I think that's being projected, whatever truth or not truth that has in the real world, I think that's being projected onto the fantasy game. And so people say, well, they're orcs, and you just don't understand their culture, or whatever. But I think that adds complications. For example, you're going to take, your party's going to go through the dungeon, killing things left and right. And then what do you do with the goblin, orc, and drow babies that are left when you clear the dungeon, right? You just killed all their parents, and they have this, but they're not, they're not evil. They could grow up to be anything. And you just like took out their whole settlement. And it's like, oh no, man, we have to like found an orphanage now for the for the offspring of all the quote unquote monsters we just killed. I mean, you can play a game that way, but it adds another complication or level of dimension to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the danger here is that, or I think the marker here is intelligence. If a quote unquote like species or race, however it's classified within D&D, if they're thinking creatures or humanoids, then, and especially like you said, Matt, if you can find that it is trying to be representative of a certain real life group, that is absolutely problematic, has no place in the game. But there is a place for an evil species in the game, so long as you can't make those real world connections of any kind. And I think that's the problem, is it's hard to track that. It's hard to put a pin on that and say, look, this right here is not acceptable, and this is. There's a lot of gray area that we're kind of muddling through. I can appreciate that it's better to err on the side of caution here and say, look, if this can be viewed in any way, whether it was intentional or not, as to be related to this certain in real life thing, then that needs to be addressed. It's harming people when it's doing that. And that's tough. That's a tough line to walk. I get that. Tom, I know you had talked before about the different races that they're bringing up, and specifically when we start getting into the Drow and how this evil underground race and all the kind of problematic things that come with that.
Well, that's the thing is as kind of a baseline, we were just looking at this. I 100% agree. They shouldn't be basing. It's one thing to base a culture, like, okay, if you base it off a location, okay, if you're a nomadic culture and some of the traits of that culture that would go with a species of elf that is a nomad, lives in the desert or something like that. I can understand applying cultural concepts, but when it comes to race and it gets mucky. And one thing that I feel could be a very sound basis is basing it off of organisms in nature. Specifically, I'm really glad they're re-looking at Drow, because Drow should not be dark skinned just based off of biology. If you look at any like underground cave dwelling organisms, they have pale skin because melanin is a biological response or a evolutionary response to protect from sunlight.
Mm-hmm.
But the Drow don't look like they have melanin. The Drow are it's like indigo skin.
Yeah, but I mean, it's still to pull out from pop culture as well. A prime example of what the Drow or whatever something analogous to the Drow would be if they actually lived in like the Underdark would be something of the Falmer elves from Elder Scrolls V Skyrim.
That's true.
They're blind. They're pale skinned. They have very good hearing. And that's an aspect because there are a lot of organisms, and even if you look at other aspects of the DMG and the monster manuals and stuff, creatures that also live in the Underdark, all of them are blind or have really good hearing. They have they don't have dark coloration on their bodies because they're actually basing it off of an animal or off of a creature, and trying to apply those concepts, I feel would be a bit of a more better understanding of how things might work. So there is no confusion or, again, trying to apply race or cultural negatives onto a sentient race, like you said, with intelligence.
Sure. And I think when it comes down to it, I like the biological look at things, Tom, but when it really comes down to it, we don't have really a good standing to say what should or should not be in these kind of cases, because we're not the ones being harmed. So I think the best route is kind of what D&D is going after in bringing players of color, different voices in, different ideas that maybe have not been listened. Well, not maybe, definitely have not been listened to in the past, and take what they are saying seriously and make the adjustments from there. And I think what we'll find is this positive progress towards these changes that we're talking about, because no player wants everything just eliminated, but there are things that are affecting people in real life, and that needs to be addressed. And I think listening to those voices are what's going to guide Wizards and all the other companies in the right direction. Yeah. But moving on to the last news item, this is from Kelly Knox over at Nerdist. God, I saw this pop up and it's just horrible. It's just horrible. Spirit Halloween, the place you go to on October 30th because you procrastinated on making a costume. They announced that they will be launching D&D costumes this year, and holy shit, do they look terrible. Matt, are you planning on wearing any of these this coming Halloween?
I would not be caught at minus 50 hit points in one of those. Frankly, I think if you want to dress up, to fit way, there's plenty. Comic book characters pretty much have that all tied up. They're pretty
it's
awful.
So bad. is so bad. Tom, what do you think? This is that a wizard or a monk? What is that?
So to point out, I recognize looking at the picture right now, I recognize the one on the left. That's actually from the animated Dungeons and Dragons TV show.
Yeah,
that is the character, the quote unquote dungeon master, who was the wizard who guided them through. And honestly, I would probably wear that just to be ironic.
But they don't have a Venture costume.
Yeah. Oh,
that would be
God,
cool.
it's so bad.
And
it's so bad.
Matt, the I don't know if you have the picture in front of you. Who's the one?
I don't have the picture up right now.
Dual-wielding drow. He's famous.
I don't. Oh,
That's the middle.
Drist Do'Urden.
Drist.
You have the two.
That's supposed to be a drow.
He's the good example of the evil race. So getting back to the drow, right? Drist. It was this revolutionary thing. R.A. Salvatore, the Drist trilogy or whatever. It was this like mind blowing thing. It's like, you have the evil drow with their demon worship and their S&M and all that, and then you have Drist is like this one drow who like
the one good one,
and sort of plays against the stereotype. So it does have some precedent. But then if the whole race is just morally misunderstood, then you can't really tell a story like that either. So so there's
regardless, these costumes are hideous. But if you want to wear something hideous and you're welcome to it. I mean,
they're scary costumes, just not in the way they intest.
The D&D like hobby, like cosplay is such a huge part of it. And I can't imagine the faces of all those people who work so hard on getting every last rivet and leather piece correct. Seeing this, it must be heartbreaking to see some of this stuff. So, but if you're interested, take a look. Who knows? For $30, maybe you can get one at the last minute.
That's overpriced.
Yeah, it is. Okay. Well, we're going to take a quick break here, but we will be right back. Stay tuned. All right, I just want to take a moment this week and point you towards a podcast that our friend Anthony has just put together. It's called One Shot Heroes, D&D podcast, and it's him taking two players through a one-shot adventure. Then it's mixed down with music and sound effects and all that stuff. The first one just came out. It's episode 1, The Desert Wellspring. Really well done, Anthony, and we support you completely. You can find that podcast if you're interested on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, I'm sure a bunch of other ones, but that's One Shot Heroes D&D podcast. And with that, let's get back to the show. All right, how about another question? This one comes from Reddit user The Monkey, who asks, are these modules friendly to new players with an experienced-ish DM? So I'll be heading for college soon, hopefully, and have begun wrangling up a group to DM for. I've been DMing off and on for about 3 years, so I have some experience and understand how the game works, and have been considering some modules to run, those being Curse of Strahd, Out of the Abyss, Storm King's Thunder, Dragon Heist, Descent into Avernus. They will all be new players, so which of these, if any, are not friendly towards new players with an experienced DM, or which of these are friendly? So, Matt, what are you thinking on this one?
So, Curse of Strahd, as I mentioned earlier in the beginning, really has a lot of recommendations, and so I think it's meant for first level characters, and I think that can work fine with a good DM good DM and new players. We're doing Avernus right now in our group, and I would say, we're a mix. We're like, I would say a mix of experience to modest to high experienced players, and I would say it's pretty challenging. We were in a nice edge in that last dungeon, and our DM's really good. And I think for new players that might be difficult, at least at low levels. I don't know if it gets easier or harder as it goes on. My recommendation would be Curse of Strahd. I can't say I'm familiar enough with the other modules he mentioned to recommend or not recommend. So that's
okay.
That's,
well, Tom, yeah, what do you think on this? Have you any experience or heard about some of these others?
See, I've heard actually Curse of Strahd was really hard and like really, really difficult for new players, but I've never played it, so I don't know off the top of my head. I have played a little bit of Storm King's Thunder. There was a local comic book shop that did a kind of a Adventure League bit where we started Storm King's Thunder, and that was, at least from what I saw, because we only went up I think to like level 5, and then it kind of like disbanded because of scheduling and stuff. But it seemed to work really, really well for that. We facing your goblins in the beginning, kind of your low level like creatures, and it slowly built up. So at least from a player perspective, it seemed to play out really well. And there were also a lot of really interesting characters that came in. We were talking to actually Storm King's Thunder, different giants and stuff like that seemed to really flesh out more than just, okay, I'm going to a dungeon, I'm going to swing my sword and kill the monster. So it had some depth as well that I think really helped incorporate, RP for new players, because we were all fairly new players in that group as well. So I would suggest looking into that and reading it for yourself. And any of these modules, if you're looking into them, I would suggest trying to see if you can get a way to read through them a little bit, just to get an idea of how it's going to work for you running it. And then before you start actually deciding you're going to run one for the group.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything horrible about these. I would agree with you, Matt, that Descent into Avernus definitely seems to, for new players, that's a tough one. I mean, like we have a few really strong, experienced players, and it's still given us plenty of headaches.
I mean, granted, our party configuration's not optimal, but still,
not the best.
It's still pretty. I would say it's still pretty tough. I mean, that dungeon is supposed to be second level. I'm like, there's no way the second level is
when 3 of our players went down in the first hit, that's not a good sign. Yeah. So I have heard great things about Dragon Heist in terms of it being really fun. So that might be an option as well. Curse of Strahd, I've heard great things about. I don't know in terms of a new player whether that's going to be too confusing or not, but there's a lot of history involved with Curse of Strahd, so it's also a good way to kind of dive pretty deep into the lore.
And Castle Ravenloft is just this iconic, the castle perched on the cliff in Eastern European legend. It's yeah.
Yeah.
One thing worth note, Curse of Strahd, I do know there is a podcast called Dice Camera Action that is actually runs through Curse of Strahd by Chris Perkins himself as the DM.
Oh, wow.
So if you're interested as a DM running Curse of Strahd, you can always just listen to that podcast and see what you think of how it's gone. And it's run by the guy who, is in charge of writing stuff for Wizards of the Coast. So he knows how it should be run. So
sure,
that's kind of a baseline.
And that's not bad advice just in general. Like I'm sure, there's a ton of actual plays out there. I'm sure you can find actual plays on YouTube or on podcasts, whatever, for probably all of these, and give it a little bit of a listen and see if it fits what you're looking for. But hopefully the monkey that kind of helps you decide which module you're going to get into next. So want to get into the next segment. There are a ton of modules out there from all the editions of D&D, good, bad, and mediocre. But we're going to focus on some of the more well-known adventures here and test just how much Matt and Tom know their official module history. Listeners, it's trivia time. Welcome to Trivia Time, where we pit our 2 guests against each other in a battle of game knowledge and history. So here's how it'll work. Now, we've been making some changes over the last couple of weeks to make things a bit more interesting. So as always, you're allowed to ring in early, but if you do, I'm going to stop reading and you'll have to answer the question without hearing the rest. Also, now you'll lose a point if you get an answer wrong. First one to buzz in gets to answer. You get it right, you get the point. You get it wrong, you lose a point, and your opponent gets a chance to steal. And this time, just to add something different, you can try to steal without fear of losing a point. So you don't be afraid to get in there with a guess if the first person who rung in got it wrong. So you 2 ready?
I guess, yeah.
All right, here we go. Question number 1. This adventure module by Gary Gygax was first printed in 1979. In it, players were based at the eponymous keep and could make multiple forays into the nearby Caves of Chaos. The caves were notoriously deadly and unpredictable, and notably didn't scale based on depth. Matt.
Is this Keep on the Borderlands?
It is. Well done. Good job. 1-0, Matt. Question number 2. The most infamous module in the history of D&D. This was created by Gygax specifically to put overpowered characters in their place. Supposedly, Tom?
Tomb of Horrors.
Tomb of Horrors is correct. Well done. 1-1. Question number 3. The first of a trilogy of modules written by Dave J. Brown and Don Turnbull. This was an introduction to a brand new underwater campaign. Players explore the sinister, haunted mansion on the outskirts of a town called Saltmarsh and learn the secrets of the evil alchemists that live there. Tom?
Ghosts of Saltmarsh?
That is incorrect. I'm sorry. Matt, chance to steal. Go ahead and give it a guess.
The thing is, it was something Saltmarsh, but I can't remember the name of it. Shoot.
Need an answer?
No, I don't. I can't. I don't remember the name of it.
It was A Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh.
Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh. I remembered it was Saltmarsh something, but I couldn't remember the.
So it is 1-0, Matt. You're still in the lead here. Question 4. Set in the frozen, savage frontier region of northern Faerun, this campaign pits the party against the giant clans of the north. This is an epic adventure that includes raiding giant strongholds, battles against dragons, and a fight against a kraken. The main goal is to help reestablish the caste system among giant kind.
I believe that is Storm King's Thunder.
That is correct. Well done.
Very good time.
Good job. So, tie ball game, 1-1. Question number 5. This classic adventure was first published in 1981 and is probably one of the most widely circulated D&D adventures in history. It gave players and dungeon masters a completely new type of gameplay, wilderness exploration. Players can go anywhere on the island, encounter several civilizations of human and non-human races, and battle against new monsters like Kopru and even dinosaurs. That was the Isle of Dread. I don't know if you remember that or not.
No, I didn't know that one.
I was thinking that there was something with Cholt, but I was thinking I couldn't think of the Cholt Mace module, which was also the wrong answer. So.
All right, still 1-1. Question number 6. In this adventure, a terrible affliction is causing people to become sick, waste away until death, and prevents them from being raised. This campaign takes place in the jungles of Cholt, which includes dangers not normally seen in D&D adventures, dinosaurs.
It's the one we just played, actually.
I can't think of what it is now.
The one in Anthony's. Come on, guys. We literally played it.
I know.
Well, it was a homebrew variation, but...
It was Tomb of Annihilation.
Tomb of Annihilation, yeah.
Dang it.
Yeah. No, I knew we played it, but I couldn't remember the name of it. Yeah. We played an abridged version of it, yeah.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. Quick question. It is 1-1, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, just making sure I wasn't off there. All right, question number 7. Released in 1983, this is probably the most iconic and well-known module in all of D&D. Written by Tracy and Laura Hickman, this campaign introduced the most recognizable D&D villain of all time, Strahd von Zarovich. Matt.
Ravenloft.
You got it. Well done. It is 2-1, Matt. Question number 8. Written by Lawrence Schick and released in 1979, this classic dungeon crawl favors encounters that only make sense in a game, right down to its handy 10-foot corridors and not one but 3 magic weapons, all hidden away inside an active volcano. Matt.
White Plume Mountain.
White Plume Mountain is correct. 3-1. Question.
We played that one also.
Yeah, we played that one too.
Also in Cholt for some reason.
Question.
Anthony moved it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Question number 9. This D&D 3rd edition adventure module, published in 2000, starts with characters hearing rumors about a citadel while staying in the nearby small town of Oakhurst. The majority of the adventure focuses on the characters exploring the citadel and encountering the malign creatures that have taken up residence within. That was the Sunless Citadel. Sunless Citadel. All right.
I heard of it. I never played it.
Last question. Question number 10. Thought by some to be the worst D&D module ever released. This 1984 adventure contains a multitude of nonsensical encounters, screwed up stat blocks, and contradictory descriptions. In it, players try to lift the curse which has brought death and drought to the land known as the Downs.
I have no idea.
That was the Forest Oracle. The Forest Oracle.
I never even heard of that one. Never even heard
apparently it is horrible. From what I've read through of it, it is super weird and confusing. But regardless of that, Matt, you are the winner of Trivia Time. Well done.
So I'm surprised that the Lost Caverns of Sojanth didn't come up. That's also one of the.
Well, I mean, I only got 10 questions. I had to mix it up a little bit, and
I was waiting for that one. I was like, oh, the one where you summon Frazer Blue. I know that one.
And I was thinking, hey, I should get Greyhawk in there or something like that.
It's hard to 10, yeah.
Spelljammers.
But well done, Matt. Good job on that. Let's get into our last post of the week. This comes from Reddit user Grognard TPK, who asks, best AD&D 2E modules. Yeah, late TSR was bad, but just as there's the odd bad BX or 1E module, surely there's the odd good 2E module. What were the best 2E modules from an OSR point of view? What would you recommend looking at, even if only for the ideas that you could then incorporate into a game you'd want to play? What second edition material do you have fond memories of? Matt, this seems to be right up your alley. Dig into that brain bank of yours. What do you have for a fellow grognard?
Well, for a straight-up dungeon crawl, you can't go wrong with Ruins of Undermountain. Great ideas for traps and obstacles. I don't remember if it was done as a standalone adventure or as a setting book. I think it may have been a setting box, but I think there were adventures in there. And Ruins of Undermountain is if you just want ideas for like traps and teleporters and other obstacles in a dungeon, just a total like death maze, that you really can't go wrong with that. For a campaign for 2E, I am going to have a very strong recommendation of a game that of a purchased campaign that I ran called Night Below, which was a campaign that could be set in Greyhawk, Mystara, or Forgotten Realms, or even other ones. You just sort of tweak some of the background information. And basically, you start in the upper levels of the Underdark, and you go way down. And it's a great full-sized campaign. It gives you a lot to work with. You can modify things if you need to. The idea behind it, as I found, was really good. I ran it. My players really enjoyed it. And the best part is, you're going into the Underdark, but at least until you get really far down, you have time. You can come back out and do other things if you want. So I highly recommend Night Below. It's basically, the module consists of 3 books, and each book is a different phase of the Underdark, and it was just a great campaign, and I highly recommend it.
Nice. Yeah, Tom, I know you don't have experience going back that far, but have you heard of any 2E modules that you would find interesting?
Not really. And if you list several modules, and I probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a 1E or a 2E module, because that's not something I've only started in 5E. And I know some talk of like 3.5 and some 4E stuff, but I'm not as read up.
Well, let's expand this out a bit, Matt. How about a 3.5 module? Are you aware of any of those?
Most of my 3.5 is Pathfinder, which is like 3.75. But Pathfinder has done a lot of these adventure paths, which are like these 6-part adventures. It's essentially a campaign, but you could stop at points if you wanted. And some of them, I've read through a couple of them, and they're usually very well put together. So I think I mentioned Rise of the Rune Lords off the top of my head, but they have a whole host of ones, and they have different types of ones. So they have, Kingmaker everyone knows about because they made a video game out of it, but that was actually an adventure path where you build your own kingdom. They have one, I can't remember the name, that takes place, Iron Gods, that takes place in the sci-fi, post-apocalyptic sci-fi country. So in addition to swords and magic, you've got like laser guns and androids from a crashed starship. So they have a lot of really cool different ones, and they have kind of the Lovecraftian horror ones. There's a few, I can't remember the names of all of them, but I kind of like the adventure path idea, because you could come into it, like if you've done other adventures and your characters are already 6th level, then you could just start with the second, the second set, in the set of 6 or something, right? Or you could just do the first one and then maybe something else comes up. So you can treat them as small modules or as full-length campaigns, depending on your players. And they're very well play-tested. They're not perfect, especially I think they did one with the Mythic rules that didn't quite work as well. But for D&D 3 point whatever, I do recommend the Pathfinder modules.
Nice. Well, those are some great recommendations. Hopefully, Grognard, you got an idea of what to check out. And so you said that was Nights Below?
Night Below, yeah. It's a box set with 3 books, 3 small books. Each book is one phase of it. And that was a great second edition campaign.
Tom, can't you wait for the day when we can be like that? I remember back in 2017, way back then, when we were playing 5th edition and all the
I ran this, I guess it was 96 or 96. Maybe 97, something like that. Yeah. I was in high school, so I was like 16 or 17 when I ran it.
Beautiful. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us this week. Remember, if you want to send in your questions or anything you find on the internet, you can send them to questions@potomacripg.com. If you'd like to support the Potomac RPG podcast, you can find us on coffee.com/Potomac RPG. And lastly, you can follow us at Potomac_RPG on Twitter and at Potomac RPG, all one word, on Instagram and YouTube. Matt and Tom, thanks so much for being on this week. That was great. A lot of great advice on some of those modules. And of course, thank you to the rest of the Potomac RPG crew and all of our wonderful listeners out there. So for the Potomac RPG podcast, I'm Adam.
I'm Matt.
And I'm Tom.
Till next time, keep those dice rolling, keep those stories coming, and never stop playing. Come on, you jerks did that on purpose.
It's like a morally mixed thing, right? I mean, maybe it's worth it, right? Maybe you killed some dickhead who doesn't matter, right? Or who's a terrible person.